Great, welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So we're going to dive right in. I feel like we're in this moment of, really trying to confront some truths in the sector right now, in our development sector. But do you feel like we've had enough of a reckoning on how data colonialism really harms communities? And what do we need to do to really, go to that next level?
Well, I didn't know anything about this. I was starting a new tech enterprise in the global development space, and I started interviewing people. And the first interview I did was with a local leader from Lake Naivasha in Kenya. And I said, so I'm from Silicon Valley, and I'm here to help you. And he says, well, I said, so tell me how tech's working for you. He says, well, it really isn't. So why? I said, well, I'm basically leading this coalition of local leaders, and we make all the decisions about land use in Lake Naivasha. It's where the flower industry and all these things are going on. And he says, but we don't actually have any of the data. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, yeah, we're the best studied ecosystem in the Rift Valley, and yet the local leaders who make all the decisions don't have any of that data. It's tied up in big NGOs, the national government, researchers. He says, and Jim, that's called data colonialism. And I'm like, oh, I'd never heard that. And then I went to talk to Nithya like a month later, and she said, oh yeah, it's a thing.
Right. Nithya, so what's your story? How did you sort of come to this moment?
Yeah, I had a really similar story. At NextLeaf, we work with ministries of health around the world. And early on, I remember talking with a ministry leader in East Africa who had talked about just her immense frustration and humiliation sitting at a conference and watching a researcher who would come in presenting data about her country and not even, like this was the first time that she had seen it. But from there, what we started looking at are what are the consequences of this, beyond that initial frustration. And what became really clear is a few things. One, that just not only was she frustrated and humiliated, but like completely disempowered. And I'm very food motivated, so I'm going to give you a quick food analogy. So imagine that you're, cooking. I love to cook soup, so I cook this Vietnamese soup pho all the time, and when I cook the soup, I make all these mistakes, especially the first 5-10 times. But it's through making those mistakes that I extract the principles. I learn by doing. And she was completely robbed of that opportunity. So instead, it was like she was handed the final, bowl of soup and a 100-page report and said, here's the lessons learned. Now, everyone's going to go off. So it really kind of removes that ability to learn from failure and disempowers people as well.
Right, and if we could just sort of describe the idea of data colonialism in one sentence, what would your sort of elevator speech for this be?
Go for it.
Yeah, all right, I got this. So we think about how data is extracted, often without the knowledge and consent of communities, and then the value is also completely extracted. So it's really those two parts of it. And I mean, we can talk about this more, but one of the other consequences that we've seen is ways that not only is the value extracted, but often that data is then used to punish. So on top of it, data is then used to decide resources are no longer going to go here because some impact was not reached. So.
And think about it, we're part of the social entrepreneurship crowd, right? We're all about community empowerment because we think that if people are making their own decisions, that they have agency. Yeah. And so we're delivering these programs, and then we suddenly realize, oh, wait a minute, we're using this data in a completely colonial way that is the opposite of our stated goals. Oh, that's not good.
And do you feel like there's some sort of similarities in the way that the tech world previously operated or still probably operates?
Well, that's my background. I was a regular tech entrepreneur. And I'll tell you, when you're starting a tech company in Silicon Valley, where I'm based, all the investors want to know, how are you going to use data to monetize it? How are you going to exploit the people using your product? And so a lot of my peers in the tech industry are coming into the nonprofit sector, they're board members, they're donors, and they say, well, of course you have to monetize their data. Of course you have to use their data to screw them over. I'm sorry, that is the dominant business model in Silicon Valley. And so, of course, that's what you need to do. It's like, no, that's actually not what we're here to do. But it's presented as just a best practice in using tech. Well, of course, if you have the data, make some money off of it.
Yeah, that sounds, we're all familiar with that. But I feel like in this room, right, we're well-meaning development professionals. In our own programs, what are some of the red flags that you think we should be recognizing and sort of really addressing?
Yeah, actually, I'll build on your point, Jim, because one of the things that we look at a lot is who does the value accrue to from the data? And of course, we've got donors, we've got stakeholders, we've got doers, we've got communities. So the value's got to accrue to everybody. But when we look at, well, who's getting most of the value? That's really kind of one of the big red flags where we look at how's this data being used? And one of the things that we saw early on, and actually I will credit part of this to somebody in a different country, another Ministry of Health official had said, he who holds the data holds the power. And we really expanded on that and thought about data is knowledge, knowledge is power, and power ultimately leads to money in the development space. Mm-hmm. And so we started to look at actually the red flags really fall from that paradigm. I don't know if you want to.
Well, yeah, the first red flag is the data belongs to your international organization or your company instead of the people about whom the data is collected. So that's a good starting red flag.
Yeah.
Want to keep running?
Yeah. So the next one is, and this is almost self-evident, but is worth saying that when the data is analyzed by people outside of that context where the data was collected, that data is interpreted without the actual local context in mind. And so that's an immediate red flag. If we don't have the people who the data was collected about around the table as part of this interpretation of the data, it's an immediate red flag.
I'm a machine learning guy. If you feed a bunch of data into the computer and the computer comes out with an answer and you just blindly apply it, the computer's dumb as a brick. You need context. It's about making humans smarter. It's not about turning everything over to the computer.
Yeah.
Oh, and then of course we have reinforcing traditional power relationships, which generally don't go very well for the local community.
Yeah, and that often plays out in complex monitoring and evaluation methodologies and all these reasons why, oh no, we can't involve the community, not yet. We've got to first apply all this, quote, rigor. So that one plays out. Little known fact, actually, my computer science PhD was specifically in how dumb computers are as a brick and how you need the humans in the loop. So.
And now you get to actually see that in practice.
That's right.
And then, I'm from the impact investing space, right? To pay for performance. Well, what that means is data can be used to punish people. Guess what? If you know that the data could be used to punish you, you might get lousy quality data that just happens to not hurt as much.
It's called perverse incentives.
Indeed, it is. Yeah. And yet, the real reason that you're using data is to learn from it.
Yeah.
Right? To do better, to actually get that insight. And, but instead, if we use data in these weird ways, it's working against our stated goals. If the goal is development is empowering communities.
Right. So what I'm hearing is that data colonialism is this extractive practice, but what we can do is to empower communities to actually use it in the right way. Do you have some good examples in terms of how it's being done or how it shouldn't be done?
Yeah, I'll get us started. So, just to kind of first clarify what we think needs to happen, one is around ownership. We need to be real clear up front who actually owns this data. And from our perspective, it's the communities where the data is collected that, whether it's a country, it's a Ministry of Health or community, the ownership should really sit there so that there's decisions around, value and all of that. And so I have one concrete example I'll share, which is Gavi. Gavi, as many of you probably know, the largest multilateral in terms of vaccine distribution and has done a lot, especially during COVID. And they were really at the forefront of any institution I've known of to really not only stake from the head of the organization, Seth Berkley, all the way through, stake countries' ownership of data, but actually write it into the contracts. It's really impressive.
Yeah, and Nithi and I build products, right? And software and technology, and they throw off data. And so for us, it's well, then we should put our money where our mouth is. So we operate the national helplines in a bunch of countries. The data belongs to the helpline. It doesn't belong to us. It's sensitive data about people in crisis. And yet, then they're going to look to us as their tech provider and say, hey, I think you should share this data with this research group. And here's the reason why you want to do that. You'll get actually the report back rather than it going into a journal that you can't afford to read, right? Or whatever it might be. So I think it's not that we're going to stop using data for all these powerful things. But the great thing about data is as you've said, 5 different groups of people can benefit from that data and it can do that responsibly. But we think if the organization that is collecting the data on the ground is actually representing that community's interests, if they're in the driver's seat, better decisions will be made about that data that are more likely to benefit the people that they serve.
Right.
Yeah.
That kind of brings me to a crucial point in the whole puzzle, which is the donors. How do we go about convincing donors that, to sort of engage in these good practices?
I mean, I have some thoughts, which is
Go for it.
I have not found that we've had to convince. I think it depends who you mean by donors. I've found that the private philanthropy is, in my experience, very much along. I mean, I won't embarrass anybody by calling out names, but I mean, I absolutely could. So, I think I've actually found quite a bit of support on the private side. I think when it comes to the sovereign donors, that's probably a different conversation, though. Because we work with ministries across Africa and Asia, we tend to come in on the ministry side of things, and so don't quite have that relationship. But I think really it's got to come from the ministries. Like even with Gavi, I do think putting Gavi out there, like having them talk more about how they did it, but that actually really came from the ministries. We just helped amplify what was already being talked about.
Yeah, and I mean the power relationship is tough, right? And a lot of foreign aid is an instrument of industrial policy at the donors.
Sure, yeah.
And data is part of industrial policy,
Yeah.
right? And so I think it's like Gavi putting a marker down is part of setting the stage. Companies will adapt. For-profit companies will adapt to these norms. They'll figure out a way to make money. And so we just have to bake some of these things in. And I would say I don't have a problem with the staff at donors. I sometimes have problems with the the rich guys, right? Who basically said, this is the way I've made my money, so this is the way you should do it. And when you say no, they're a little irritated.
Well, I mean, I don't know if we have time, Amrita, but I love Jim's example of in Silicon Valley, separate from we've used Silicon Valley as a bad example, but there's a really positive example in Silicon Valley where actually organizations are incentivized to build common infrastructure, to actually come together and pool resources. So I think there's actually some positive things also that we could be pulling from that we could actually do some learning on. Instead of building it all myself, I gotta build my whole stack. Imagine if every person who started a tech company had to build the entire HTTP, TCP stack by themselves. It's madness. So that's what we do in the social sector, so.
Right. Partnerships are great, and here at Devex, we'll continue to report on that and continue to dig deeper into this question of data colonialism. I like sort of ending on this positive, optimistic note. Thank you so much, both of you, for being here. Thanks so much for being a great audience. Thank you.